Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I'm somehow going a bit back to classical publication problem and events happening in this context. And I'm in the lucky position that something happened in the meantime after we agreed that I would give this talk, which perfectly fits into what the previous speakers have already described. So that's quite consistent, but from a different perspective. So I'm going to go back to basic principles, and then we'll show you two striking examples. One of them has already been mentioned, but a new one I haven't been aware of days ago. Okay, so that's the contents. I'm very quick in the beginning because you know all this. You know this picture of these two worlds where we try to get better connection between the world of science and generating data and usage on the other side. So the previous talks have talked about it. And I'm going to concentrate a little bit more about the size of the problem and those who are involved in it. And what is well known is that 50% at least, on average, knowledge produced in research and science never sees the public. And the selection of what we see below the red line is, as we have heard before, and I think I can only support that, is heavily biased. And if you go through the literature, there are dozens of studies who confirm that, and one of them we did in Germany. We did this study, although it was not really necessary, because it was very clear what we would find. Again, very close to the 50% limit, published in an ethics journal, because this is an ethics problem. And if you go across different fields, stratify it, you see here that it may go across countries, size, phase, funder. It's always very close to the 50% line. So 50% of what we do, where patients participate in trials, where money is invested, is lost. And as Peter said, and others before, this is just not acceptable. Just back to definitions. What we usually see is the word publication bias, but we have to be a bit careful because I think selective reporting is much, much better, and then it's on two levels. One level is concerning whole trials. They disappear or don't appear. And the other side of this is the second one here, information distorted in the process between the study protocol and the final publication. And if we then cover this under the general roof of selective reporting, I think we are in a much more comfortable situation. Is it harmful? We've emphasized that before, of course, but it's much worse because if the start, the base trials is wrong, all the rest has to be wrong. That means the whole approach the Cochrane collaboration is so proud of, literature-based working, is in principle faulty because the base is wrong. And that's much more serious than most people think. So HTA reports, what Holger said about clinical guidelines, we can have serious doubts on most of what we see because the base is wrong. And if you want to see very modern and consistent look at it, this is very easy to find with Google. That's the European Science Foundation, this implementation paper recently published, and there will be another implementation meeting at the end of this month with the European Ministers of Health, I think even in Copenhagen, because the chair of the European Science Foundation is a Danish lady. And this will go further into that direction. And this is, for example, only one example where I did nothing wrong as far as I know. This is one example where you see explicitly harm is addressed and the size of harm. And if you look at for example, the executive summary, you see here all over the place, promote rigorous reporting of all clinical studies. So this may support your activities with the agencies on the higher political level to get this happen, to see this happen. And if you go further, for example, look at the Declaration of Helsinki, paragraph 18 is on registration, paragraph 30 is on publication. So if you have a careful look, the problem is acknowledged and nobody really doubts that it is a problem, But if you look for solutions, then you are in trouble. And one has been mentioned several times before, Tamiflu. Already the problem, the definition of the problem is a problem itself, because it's a huge confusion looking at Tamiflu for individual therapy or in the context of pandemic plans. And what you see here is the review which was published on the 18th of January. You see here, after piecing together, and this goes into the same direction as what Peter just described, 16,000 pages of clinical trial data. So this review really went back to the clinical trial reports. And then if you go to the press release, you see here again all these sentences you see again and again. More than 60% of the persons involved have not been published. Over 1,400 people in one of the central trials have never been published. Access to a proportion of the data was given by Roche, but not to the full data. So this is just the opposite of what Peter just requested. And what happened then was, and this is one of my hobbies, work with the media. I have invested a lot of time over the last 10 years, and a kind of an explosion went off more than ever before in Central Europe. And this, for example, is an interview in the new Neue Zürcher Zeitung. So there's a new Zurich daily newspaper. The reputation of this is far above, I think, the best German. It's one of the Central European top journals. They gave a full page for an interview on, the title here says, "The arms of those who are against transparency are very long." And it's very explicit. And this was more or less a bomb, because this went directly, for example, to the Swiss Academy of Medical Sciences. I have been invited for May for the ethics boards, for example. And Switzerland is a really nice place to do these things, except skiing, because Roche is in there and WHO. So the two main guilty players are in Switzerland. And I'm looking forward to what's going to happen there. The same happened, for example, in Germany. They played with the title, "The Fever of Good Faith," is the title. So this was full page 2 of the biggest German daily newspaper. It was also in New York Times. So something seems to happen right now in these days. We don't know where we end with it, but it's certainly a stronger reaction than ever before. The second example is just the opposite in terms of only focusing on industry. So what we have seen so far is not really surprising, because we know that industry is behaving badly. This is the academic world. And this is what you see here, without going into details, a 1 million children trial in India. You see the sentence here, the world's largest ever RCT. This is taken from a letter to the Lancet. It's all happening now. And this is purely from the academic world. And the trialist is somebody I think you all know. So this is example number 2. And all this, if you look at the size of this trial, for example, 1 million. If you look at the bigger picture, what we usually have, if you try to synthesize information, you have a lot of small trials. But what you should do if you do a systematic review, look at ongoing trials. That's the rationale behind looking at registers. In this case, this trial would certainly change the current knowledge if you include it, and it is restricted from being included in systematic reviews. And this will happen if you don't do that in the beginning. That's the rationale, the background of the WHO network of registers. Most people rely, medical persons, and medical training is absolutely focused on Medline. Medline, based on what I've just said, is first of all only half of the truth. So what you should do here is draw a line which is then somewhere here. So the increase, the yearly increase of visible RCTs per year of around 20,000 in reality is 40,000, but it's even higher because Medline is far away from having everything in it. So who is guilty? I didn't have more space on this slide. I think they are all guilty, and it's not only industry. I think Teddy emphasized that in the beginning. It is, of course, industry, but it's researchers and scientists, it's universities and faculties as organizations, heavily ethics boards. We already mentioned journals and publishers. And on the political side, it's funders, regulators, the agencies themselves, WHO, and also parliaments and governments. You may hesitate if you hear parliaments and governments, but what you see here, again, just happened 2 weeks ago. That's the Bavarian parliament. Bavaria has 12 million inhabitants. That's about 2.5 the size of Norway. And at stake is restocking Tamiflu on a level of 13 million euros. And the debate was between the opposition and the government based on the Cochrane review. The result is in my pocket. I didn't have time to read it so far. But what will happen is probably they try to rumble on without looking at the data. Then you could argue, okay, that's fine. Germany is usually at the bottom of the valley of this whole process. But let's look at the heaven, Australia. What you see here is a government report. This is the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration. And it's probably difficult to read. Oh, no, you can read it. What you see here is that the TGA expects full study reports containing study protocol and HC and so on and so on. These full clinical study reports are at present unavailable to us. And the conclusion is always, and this happens in countries all around the world, the registered indications for Tamiflu in Australia remain valid. And it's certainly not exaggerated to say that this is just the common standard. And this will probably happen in Germany too. The game is usually that the state is referring it to the federal government. They are referring it to an institution. And they say, well, WHO told us that you should continue. So that's how it suddenly works. Let's have a look at the laws. The US has developed a law. You see here the timing. This is from 2007. Register and report results of certain applicable clinical trials. Germany, at the bottom of the valley, amendment of the drug law, 2011. Trial registration, nothing. They introduced a paragraph on publications, but that's a tricky thing. Publication only appears in the title, but in the text, after the first draft had publication all over the text, they changed everything in the last minute to make available. And this has happened years ago, confidentially. So the whole thing has been continued as it was before, and again, the beginning of this year. And where we can expect some movement now is from Switzerland. They designed and passed a federal law on research in humans. And this will come to power in next year. And for example, simple things like paragraph 56, approved trials have to be registered in a public register. Quite simple. So this is coming very soon. The reasons for non-compliance, without going into detail, are certainly conflict of interest. But there are many, many others. And I think if you only look at conflict of interest in industry, we will fail. There's a large range of simple things like human weaknesses, untidy behavior, laziness, and so on, especially among researchers. Then there is a deep averseness against transparency. Then there are legal games, for example. In 14 of the German 16 states, they refer to the Declaration of Helsinki, but to the version of 1997. So they do not do what we call dynamic citation. And of course, not surprising, that version doesn't even mention registration and publication. Okay, and last but not least, lack of responsibility for the big picture. The title of my talk was Open, this project, this European project. And in principle, all we do in the project is to tie together all these different perspectives and not to try to find solutions, but at least to analyze them in context and make suggestions how to proceed in this context. So those of you who have been through such a process know how painful that is. In the end, if you succeed, you see a sum of money which looks a lot, but it's not really, because we have a big consortium. The time which this will last is 24 months. It started November last year. We succeeded in putting together a quite impressive consortium. I'm not going through all these names. You see here, Paris Descartes is part of it. Cochrane is not as visible as it could be, because Cochrane centers are usually legally implemented in faculties or in other institutions. So there's more Cochrane in it than on it. You see, for example, I said that ethics boards are guilty. So we have ethics in here. You have industry in here. So Jos Kleinen is investigating industry. So we do what I said before, go across all the stakeholders, have a close look at them, survey them, ask publishers what they are going to do, look at publication instructions, and so on, and then put it together. Under the advisory board, this looks like a very small enterprise, actually. So 2 speakers of this morning are on the advisory board. And the key points you see again here are funding agencies, industry, ethics boards. So this very consistent picture between the problems I've just described and how we're trying to tackle them. We try to bring stakeholders together across Europe. We will organize a workshop after the first year. And this workshop will be based on the results from this first project base. And where I'm very confident is that we got a clear order to think politically. So this is not really a research and a scientist project, but we are asked to come up with suggestions together with stakeholders. And the good thing is, if you understand the European principle of these projects, if we are successful in coming to grips with these challenges, then this will flow into the next funding program. And this is something we have to be really active if we want to change something. So in summary, if you look at what happened over the last years, you see many things happening, but many of these introduced measures are lip service. They haven't really changed much. It looks very nice, more action, but no results. And the problem is much, much bigger than most people acknowledge and recognize. The insight in the deficits by all these research projects has certainly grown a lot, but the solutions to really change something has not. And I think, and this is one of the outputs of this morning, I think, is that the balance between trial registration as a birth certificate, then publication, how to enforce it, but because that's impossible, really to go to raw data where it is necessary, that's the big issue for the next years. We do contribute a little bit to that one with organizing the Equator meeting in October in Freiburg. And I'm now, in these days, organizing a meeting on the day before this, where, for example, Peter Doshi will come, who was mentioned by Teddy. So he's the one who wrote this last report on data transparency and PLOS a few weeks ago. And we will also have a regulator from EMA at the same meeting. So this confirms what you say, that there are quite a few people who really want to proceed and not to stay in this unacceptable status for longer time. Thank you very much for your attention.